Hi everyone, it's Mrs. D again. More big picture stuff about cellular respiration before we get on to glycolysis. Okay, I just wanted to give you location. Where are these processes occurring inside of cells? So cellular respiration is occurring in both the cytosol and in the mitochondria. So let's look at those three pathways that make up cellular respiration: glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. Glycolysis is occurring or taking place within the cytosol. This is outside of this organelle, the mitochondria, and it's occurring in the cytosol. Okay? So glycolysis, this process or pathway, produces some ATP, and it also removes electrons from the glucose to be transferred ultimately to oxygen. Okay? If we go back to this overall formula for the reaction here, we notice glucose plus oxygen becomes carbon dioxide plus water plus energy. Okay? This molecule is being oxidized, this molecule is being reduced. So electrons are being transferred from here in the form of hydrogen atoms to the oxygen. Well, how do they get to the oxygen are going to be our big focus of this chapter. These atoms or electrons, the electrons are not transferred directly to oxygen. Notice I just put electrons up here. So in the process of glycolysis, electrons are transferred ultimately to get to oxygen, but they're transferred to another molecule first. And we're going to talk about that in a second. The products of glycolysis enter the mitochondria, and the citric acid cycle takes over. And in the citric acid cycle, more ATP is produced, and more electrons are transferred. Again, are these electrons transferred directly to oxygen at this point? No. There are carrier molecules that help in this process to carry the electrons to oxygen in order to reduce the oxygen. Okay? Finally, in the last pathway, oxidative phosphorylation, this is the pathway which ultimately receives all the electrons being transferred from the other molecules, and it generates the most ATP. It's the pathway that generates the most ATP in this entire process. Okay? Let's focus on, we're going to talk about ATP first, and then we'll focus on the electron carriers. But before we do, I just want you to look at the mitochondria. It's important that you know the structure of the mitochondria really well. Know that there's a double membrane, an outer and an inner membrane. Where is the citric acid cycle occurring in the mitochondria? Well, it's occurring in the mitochondrial matrix, this space inside the mitochondria. Oxidative phosphorylation is actually occurring on through proteins embedded on the inner membrane of the mitochondria. And between the inner and outer membrane, you should know that this is called the intermembrane space, and that's important when we talk about proton pumps. Okay? So let's look at these three pathways: glycolysis happening in the cytosol, the citric acid cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation happening in the mitochondria. All three of these pathways generate some ATP for the cell. So how does this, are they all generated the same way? Actually, no. ATP can be generated two ways. One you already know, actually. Substrate level phosphorylation you learned about during the last chapter, where an enzyme is able to bind ADP and add the last phosphate group and phosphorylate ADP so that ADP plus phosphate become ATP. So this is called substrate level phosphorylation. And it does not produce as much ATP as the other method of producing ATP, which is called oxidative phosphorylation. This type of production of ATP involves two processes. It involves the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis, and we're going to talk about that in detail when we get to that pathway. For now, just understand that oxidative phosphorylation involves the transfer of electrons through a series of proteins embedded on the inner membrane of the mitochondria, and it transfers them stepwise so that there isn't this explosive transfer of energy. In other words, when an electron moves from a state of high potential energy to a state of lower potential energy, instead of going down, remember, where are the electrons moving to in all of these pathways? They're trying to get to oxygen, okay? Because oxygen is the molecule being reduced in this whole reaction. But if the electrons just transferred from a high energy state to a low energy state in one explosive reaction, it would not be an efficient way to harvest this energy. So the electrons are transferred in this stepwise series from one molecule to another, and each time releasing enough energy in order to form or produce ATP. And again, this is a special way to produce ATP, so we're going to talk about that, including the proton pump. But substrate level phosphorylation is simply an enzyme being used to bring two reactants closer together in order to generate ATP. So, in the big picture again, glycolysis produces ATP through substrate level phosphorylation. The citric acid cycle also produces ATP through substrate level phosphorylation, but oxidative phosphorylation produces ATP through the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis, okay? All right, so now that we've just given the overview of these ATP molecules and that all three pathways do produce ATP, now let's look at the electrons, this electron transport. Electrons, glucose is being oxidized again, oxygen's being reduced. Electrons have to get to this oxygen, but they don't go there immediately. They're taken there by these molecules that assist, that are really good at transporting electrons. What does it mean to be really good at transporting electrons? It means when an electron transfers to it, not a lot of potential energy is lost. And one of the great molecules is this molecule NAD+, because there's a positive charge on that molecule. NAD plus and FAD, these two molecules accept electrons, and they carry these electrons. Where are they taking them in this whole process? They're taking them to the electron transport chain, which is occurring, which is part of oxidative phosphorylation, okay? So, electrons released, or I guess during glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, are carried via NAD plus and FAD to the electron transport chain. And ultimately, these electrons are heading towards oxygen. And those electrons are in a lower energy state once they get to oxygen, because oxygen is a very electronegative atom. They hold those electrons more tightly. It's a more stable state. Energy is released in the process, and through that energy, ATP is formed. Okay? So again, more big picture, location of these three pathways, where they're happening inside the cells, and that ATP is generated by all three pathways, but it's this pathway that generates the most ATP. The structure of the mitochondria is important, and that the fact that electrons are not jumping directly to oxygen, but actually are being carried by these other molecules, which we will discuss in class in more detail, and through the PowerPoint there's pictures of these molecules, that these molecules are transporting electrons to the electron transport chain, okay? Now we're going to start with the details of glycolysis.